Beginning of the end of the colonists being a peaceful part of the empire, though, was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a monumentally stupid tax. For one thing, it was clearly not about regulating trade, which the other acts they at least pretended they were, but it was directly to raise revenue. This act said we see the colonies as a source of money. It was also a stupid tax because it was a direct tax. Now, let me explain. If you put a tax on sugar, the guy importing the sugar pays the tax, and then the price of sugar on the shelf in the store goes up, and you know it went up, but you don't realize necessarily anything about the tax. But the way the Stamp Act worked is anything you got that had printed matter on it. So if you bought a deck of playing cards or a contract or a newspaper or a book or anything like this, you would pay the normal price of the good, and then you would have to go into your wallet again and pull out more money to pay to get the stamp affixed to it. And this is the stamp here on the left. That's why it's called the stamp tax. And so you knew very well that you were paying it. Imagine that if you went to the grocery store and instead of adding the taxes into your groceries, you had one transaction, and then you had a second transaction to pay the taxes. It would really call attention to how much you were paying in sales tax, right? And it would probably make the tax much less popular. The other problem with it is it hit the most influential people in the colonies. It hit rich people. It hit tavern owners, and we've talked about taverns as these kind of centers for discussion. It hit lawyers because they used lots of printed materials in their line of work, and of course they were probably well read. And taxes that hit the most educated and organized and wealthy members of society tend to cause a lot of backlash because those people are in a position to fight back. In the House of Burgesses, a man named Patrick Henry will stand up and make a speech, and in the end he suggests that if the king doesn't stop taxing them, they should cut off his head. This is in 1765. Despite shouts of treason, many people agree with Patrick Henry and support him. And so Henry will take a leading role in writing what are called the Virginia Resolves. They say this: the colonists have the same rights as Englishmen. There is no difference between the two. And specifically they mean the right to be tried by a jury of your peers. They're talking about having to be taken back to England for a trial. They think that's a violation of their rights. Only the House of Burgesses can tax Virginia, or by extension any other colony. So if you're going to pass a tax in Virginia, it has to go to the House of Burgesses. Parliament can't do it on their own. In response to this, and the Stamp Act generally, James Otis of Massachusetts calls for an intercolonial Congress. Representatives from 9 colonies will meet in New York, and this comes to be called the Stamp Act Congress. James Otis, by the way, it will be from his writings that we get the now legendary phrase, taxation without representation is tyranny. Meanwhile, Samuel Adams is organizing the Sons of Liberty. And these are basically young men who go around and beat up tax collectors and vandalize British officials' house. They're a little more than a gang, except they're protesting something specific, taxation. And they are young and they are violent, and today we would call them thugs or ruffians. Great Britain didn't really care about all this, to be honest. They could live with all these things. But what they couldn't live with was the economic impact, because Americans began organizing boycotts. They refused to buy the taxed goods. And so the British businessmen who were losing revenue because the Americans weren't buying sugar and molasses and such, or printed goods, went and complained to Parliament, and members of Parliament were beholden. They got money from these businessmen, and so they demanded the taxes be repealed, and they were. On March 18th, 1776, all of these taxes are repealed. 1766, are repealed, but they are replaced by something called the Declaratory Act, which was the new Prime Minister, who we call Rockingham, declared that Parliament did in fact have the right to tax the colonies, although when he took all the taxes away, who cared? But that is going to come back later. Rockingham was widely criticized for giving in to the colonies and replaced by, he was the Prime Minister, he was replaced by Pitt, the guy who would run the French and Indian War. Pitt was very old and out of it, and his administration was really run by an ambitious young man called Charlie Townsend, or Good Time Charlie as they called him back then. He's over here in the wig with the cross on his shoulder. Massachusetts and New York were refusing to pay for troops. So in 1767, Townsend disbands the New York Assembly. He just kills it. And he passes the Townsend duties on lead, paper, paint, and tea. These are taxes on all these goods. He thought duties were different than taxes. He thought that if you charged them when they came off the boat, the colonists wouldn't mind. They just didn't want to be taxed directly like the Stamp Act. But he was wrong. And he also, in disassembling the New York Assembly and the Massachusetts Assembly, he had created a paranoia in the colonies that all their governments were going to be disassembled. He did bring the Navy over and end smuggling in Boston, which actually angered everybody in Boston because the merchants and the consumers appreciated the lower prices too. And the Boston boycotts will eventually spread to New York and Philadelphia. And at this point, American homespun, which is this material on the bed down here, becomes all the rage because it can be made locally without having to use British goods. And this is a great example of the type of boycotts that they enacted. By the way, here's Samuel Adams' Sons of Liberty, tarring and feathering a tax collector and then forcing him to drink something that's certainly going to make him sick. In 1767, Townsend dies unexpectedly, and it won't be until 1770 until a new prime minister is put in place, Lord North. Lord North, responding again to pressure due to colonial boycotts, will repeal all the taxes placed on the colonies except for tea. And he leaves tea as a symbol because tea, of course, is a symbol of the British government. Before news of these repeals could reach America, so while the boat is bringing the news over, a fight breaks out in Boston. Now what's going on is the redcoats, the British soldiers, will go down and work at the docks at night to supplement their income. Well, the people of Boston want those jobs too, and so there's a lot of animosity because both of them want this job, but the soldiers get them, and the people of Boston feel like they're getting short shrift here. So after a riot breaks out down at the docks on the night of March 4th, 1770, some of the dock workers show up the next day where the Redcoats, where the British Army, is guarding the customs house in Boston, and begin screaming taunts at the soldier on guard because apparently he was one of the guys involved in the riot. More soldiers eventually come to his aid, and the Bostonians begin throwing snowballs at the soldiers, and eventually they begin throwing snowballs with rocks in them. Well, they hit one of the soldiers, and nobody knows who fired first. The British claim the colonists did it. The colonists claim the British did it. But by the time it's all over, blood has been shed in Boston. Americans are dead in Boston, including possibly the first person to die in the Revolution, Crispus Attucks, who happens to be a free black man. Paul Revere takes advantage of this. Paul Revere is a printer, and he prints this plate that you see here on the screen. It's called "Innocent Blood Crying to God from the Streets of Boston." And this is propaganda. I mean, if you look here, the Americans look completely defenseless. There's even a cute little dog there. And the British soldiers look like they're just murdering them. Revere gets this spread all over the colonies in a matter of days and wins the public relations war. And in America anyway, the troops in the Boston Massacre are clearly seen as the bad guys. Interestingly enough, it'll be Samuel Adams' cousin John, who is the only lawyer in Boston who will agree to defend the troops. And he will get all of them either acquitted, saying they didn't do it, or get very light sentences. And so John Adams actually kind of enters our story defending the troops here. Now, he was on the revolutionary side generally, but he did think the soldiers deserved a fair defense, and he gave it to them. In 1772, partly in response to this, Samuel Adams will start committees of correspondence in Massachusetts. These are people who write letters to each other with ideas about revolution and governmental theories that are going to eventually, of course, become the American Revolution.